Section 5 of The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Chapter 5. Formation of the Historical Races. How historical races are formed. Conditions which allow of different races combining to form a single race. Influence of the number of the individuals involved in the process, of the dissimilarity of their characters, of the environments, etc. Results of crossbreeding, causes of the great inferiority of half-breeds, mobility of the new psychological characteristics created by crossbreeding, how these characteristics come to be fixed, the critical periods of history. Crossbreeding constitutes an essential factor in the formation of new races, and at the same time a powerful factor in the dissolution of civilizations. Importance of the regime of castes. Influence of environment. Environment can only exert its influence on new races in process of formation, and on races whose ancestral characteristics are giving way before the action of crossbreeding. Environment is without influence on old races. Various examples. The majority of the historical races of Europe are still in process of formation. Political and social consequences. Why the period of formation of historical races will soon be over. We have already remarked that genuine races, in the scientific sense of the word, are scarcely to be met with among civilized peoples, but only historical races, by which is meant races created by the chances of conquest, immigration, politics, etc., and formed in consequence of a mixture of individuals of different origins. How do these heterogeneous races come to combine and to form an historical race possessing common psychological characteristics? This is the point we are about to investigate. Let it first of all be observed that the elements brought together by chance do not always combine. The German, Hungarian, Slav, and other populations that live under Austrian rule form perfectly distinct races, which have never attempted to fuse. The Irish, who live under the rule of the English, are another example of fusion not taking place. As for the quite inferior peoples such as Redskins, Australians, or Tasmanians, not only do they not combine with the superior peoples, but they disappear rapidly after they have come in contact with them. Experience proves that every inferior people which is confronted with a superior people is inevitably condemned to disappear at an early date. Three conditions are necessary to allow of races fusing and forming a new and more or less homogeneous race. The first condition is that the races which are to interbreed shall not be too unequal in number. The second, that their characters shall not be too dissimilar. The third, that they shall be subjected for a long period to identical conditions of environment. The first of the conditions that have just been enumerated is of capital importance. A small number of white men transported into the midst of a numerous Negro population disappear after a few generations without leaving any trace of their blood among their descendants. All the conquerors who have invaded too numerous populations have disappeared in this way. They have been able, as has been done by the Latins in Gaul or the Arabs in Egypt, to leave behind them their civilization, their arts, and their language, but they have never been able to bequeath their blood. The second of the preceding conditions is also of very great importance. Doubtless very different races, the black and the white, for example, may fuse, but the half-breeds that result constitute a population very inferior to those of which it is sprung, and utterly incapable of creating or even of continuing a civilization. The influence of contrary heredities saps their morality and character. When half-breeds, the offspring of white men and Negroes, have chanced to inherit a superior civilization, as in Saint Domingo, this civilization has speedily been overtaken by the most lamentable degeneration. Cross-breeding may be a source of improvement when it occurs between superior and sufficiently allied races, such as the English and the Germans of America, but it always constitutes an element of degeneration when the races, even though superior, are too different. Footnote. All the countries inhabited by too large a proportion of half-breeds are, solely for this reason, given over to perpetual anarchy, unless they are ruled by an iron hand. Such will inevitably be the fate of Brazil. White men form only a third of its population. The remainder is composed of Negroes and mulattoes. The famous Agassiz rightly observed, quote, that it is sufficient to have visited Brazil for it to be impossible to deny the decadence that results from cross-breeding, which goes on in this country to a greater extent than elsewhere. This cross-breeding is fatal, he says, to the best qualities whether of the white man, the black or the Indian, and produces an indescribable type whose physical and mental energy suffers." Unquote. End of footnote. To cross two peoples is to change simultaneously both their physical constitution and their mental constitution. Crossbreeding, moreover, constitutes the only infallible means at our disposal of transforming in a fundamental manner the character of people, heredity being the only force powerful enough to contend with heredity. Crossbreeding allows of the creation of a new race, possessing new physical and psychological characteristics. The characteristics thus created are at the outset very weak and fluctuating. To fix them long, hereditary accumulations are necessary. The first effect of interbreeding between different races is to destroy the soul of the races, and by their soul we mean that congeries of common ideas and sentiments which make the strength of peoples, and without which there is no such thing as a nation or a fatherland. The period of interbreeding is the critical period in the history of peoples, a period of commencement and hesitancy which all nations have had to traverse, for there is scarcely a European people that is not formed of the debris of other peoples. It is a period full of intestine struggles and of vicissitudes, and it continues so long as the new psychological characteristics are not fixed. What precedes shows that interbreeding should be considered at once as a fundamental element in the formation of new races and as a powerful factor in the dissolution of ancient races. It is with reason, then, that all the peoples that have reached a high degree of civilization carefully avoid intermarrying with foreigners. Had it not been for the admirable regime of castes, the handful of Aryans that invaded India some 3,000 years ago would have been quickly swamped by the immense masses of the dark-colored populations that surrounded them on every side, and no civilization would have come into existence on the soil of the great peninsula. If in modern times the English had not followed the same system, if they had consented to intermarry with the indigenous inhabitants, their gigantic Indian empire would long since have slipped from their grasp. A people may sustain many losses, may be overtaken by many catastrophes, and yet recover from the ordeal, but it has lost everything, and is past recovery when it has lost its soul. It is at the moment when decadent civilizations have become the prey of peaceful or warlike invaders that interbreeding fills in succession the destructive and then the creative role of which I have just spoken. Cross-breeding destroys an ancient civilization because it destroys the soul of the people that possesses it. It fosters the creation of a new civilization because the old psychological characteristics of the races in contact have been destroyed, and because new characteristics may be formed under the influence of the new conditions of existence. It is only on races in course of formation and whose ancestral characteristics have been destroyed in consequence by contrary heredities that the influence can be effective of the last of the factors mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, the influence of environment. While very slight on ancient races, the influence of environment is, on the contrary, very great on new races. Cross-breeding, by destroying the ancestral psychological characteristics, creates a sort of blank tablet on which the action of environment, continued during centuries, may succeed in impressing and finally in giving fixity to new psychological characteristics. Then, and then only, the formation of a new historical race results. It is in this way that the French race was constituted. The influence of environment, physical or moral, is in consequence very great or very slight, according to circumstances, and this is the explanation of the contrary opinions that have been formulated with regard to its action. We have just seen that this influence is very great on races in course of formation, but had we been considering ancient races solidly established by the long action of heredity, we could have said that the influence of environment is, on the contrary, almost inappreciable. As regards moral environment, we have proof of the significance of its action in the failure of our Western civilizations to influence the peoples of the East. Even when these latter have been subjected to their contact during several generations, the Chinese inhabitants of the United States are a case in point. The slight power of physical environment is shown by the difficulties that attend acclimatization. Transported into surroundings too different from those to which it is accustomed, an ancient race, and the statement is equally applicable to men, animals and plants, perishes sooner than submit to transformation. Egypt has always been the tomb of the many different races that have effected its conquest. Not a single people has been able to acclimatize itself in the country. Neither Greeks, Romans, Persians, Arabs, nor Turks have been able to leave behind them a trace of their race. The only type that is met with is that of the impassible fellah, whose features exactly resemble those engraved 7,000 years ago on the tombs and palaces of the pharaohs by the Egyptian artists. The majority of the historical races of Europe are still in course of formation, and it is important that it should be known that this is the case with a view to understanding their history. At the present day, the Englishman is the only European who represents an almost completely fixed race. In this case, the ancient Briton, the Saxon, and the Norman have given way to a new and highly homogeneous type. In France, on the contrary, the provincial is very different from the Breton, the inhabitant of Auvergne, from the inhabitant of Normandy. Still, if there does not exist as yet an average type of the Frenchman, there at least exists average types of certain regions. Unfortunately, these types are very distinct as regards their ideas and character. It is difficult in consequence to devise institutions which shall suit them all equally well, and it is only by dint of energetic concentration that it is possible to lend them some community of thought. Our profound divergences of sentiment and belief, and the political upheavals which result therefrom, are due in the main to differences of mental constitution, which the future alone will perhaps be able to efface. Such has always been the situation when different races have found themselves in contact. The dissentiments and intestine struggles have always been the more acute in proportion as the races in presence have been the more different. When they are too unlike, it becomes absolutely impossible to make them live under the same institutions and the same laws. The history of great empires composed of different races has always been identical. Most often they disappear with their founder. Among modern nations, only the English and the Dutch have been successful in imposing their yoke on Asiatic peoples, differing widely from them, and their success is solely due to the fact that they have respected the manners, customs, and laws of the peoples in question, leaving them in reality to govern themselves, and confining their role to appropriating a portion of the taxes, to engaging in commerce, and to maintaining peace. Apart from these rare exceptions, all the great empires composed of dissimilar peoples owe their foundation to force and are destined to perish by violence. To enable a nation to constitute itself and to endure, it is necessary that its formation should be slow, and the result of the gradual fusion of but slightly different races, interbreeding, living on the same soil, undergoing the action of the same environment, and having the same institutions and beliefs. After the lapse of several centuries, these distinct races may come to form a highly homogeneous nation. As the world grows older, the races become more and more stable, and their transformation by means of fusion rarer and rarer. As it advances in age, humanity feels the burden of heredity grow heavier, and transformations become more difficult. So far as Europe is concerned, it may be said that the era of the formation of historical races will soon be over. End of section 5.